The morning Emma Walker rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she had 43 cents, a loaded revolver she did not know how to fire properly, and a dead husband's name stitched inside her traveling coat, which was how she came to stand in the middle of the main street in the August heat of 1873, staring at a town that looked as though it had been assembled hastily and without much hope of permanence. Caldwell was a cattle town on the edge of Indian Territory, and it smelled like it. The stockyards ran along the southern edge of the settlement, and the wind, when it chose to move at all in that brutal summer, carried the particular perfume of 10,000 longhorns across every porch and through every window. The buildings along Front Street were a mixture of raw lumber and sod, the kind of architecture that said plainly that no one was entirely certain they would still be here in 10 years. The saloon was the sturdiest structure Emma could identify, which she thought said something unkind about the priorities of the men who had built this place. She was 26 years old. Her husband, Thomas Walker, had died 7 months earlier of a fever that had started as a cough in November and finished him by January, leaving her with a quarter section of land outside of Wichita that the bank informed her, with considerable politeness and no genuine regret, was mortgaged beyond recovery. She had sold what she could sell, packed what she could carry, and followed the advice of her late husband's cousin, who had written that Caldwell was growing, and that a woman who could cook and keep books might find respectable work at a boarding house recently opened by one Harriet Dunmore. Emma stood in the street with her one traveling trunk beside her, the stage having deposited her and her luggage, and then rattled on without ceremony, and she looked at Caldwell and felt something that was not quite despair but was close enough to it that she could taste its edges. She had not cried since the funeral. She had decided, somewhere in the practical geography of grief, that crying was a luxury she could not presently afford. She had prayed at Thomas's graveside, mechanically, the words of the 23rd Psalm moving through her mouth like water through a dry creek bed, present but leaving nothing behind. After that, she had not prayed at all. She was not angry at God, precisely. She simply could not find the thread of conversation. She picked up the handle of her trunk and began to drag it toward the nearest person, a heavy-set woman in a yellow apron who was sweeping dust from the porch of what appeared to be a dry goods store with the resigned determination of someone who had been sweeping the same dust for years and intended to continue. "Excuse me," Emma said. "I'm looking for Harriet Dunmore's boarding house." The woman pointed her broom handle down the street without stopping her sweeping. "Second left past the livery, 2-story with the green shutters. You the one she's been expecting?" "I believe so, Emma Walker." The woman looked at her for a moment with the frank appraisal of someone who has learned that the frontier is no place for ceremony. "You look tired," she said. "She'll feed you before she puts you to work. That's something at least." Emma thanked her and hauled her trunk down the street, and that was how she arrived in Caldwell, and that was how her life in the West properly began. Harriet Dunmore was a compact, energetic woman of 50 who had come to Kansas from Missouri a decade earlier with her husband, who had since died of causes she described only as an argument with a horse that the horse won. She had built her boarding house from the insurance money and the sheer force of a personality that seemed to occupy more space than her physical body. She welcomed Emma with warm bread and cool water and a room on the second floor that had a window overlooking the backyard, where a kitchen garden struggled with admirable determination against the Kansas summer. "You'll manage the books and help with the cooking," Harriet told her over supper that first evening. "I've got 6 permanent boarders and 2 rooms for travelers. The permanent men are decent enough. One of them is a particular kind of difficult, but you'll learn him." "What kind of difficult?" Emma asked. Harriet considered this. "The quiet kind," she said finally. "The kind that's been somewhere hard and come back different from it." She did not explain further, and Emma did not press. She had met that kind before. Her father had come back from the Mexican War with that same quality, a heaviness in the eyes, a carefulness around loud noises, a tendency to sit with his back to a wall. She understood it as a category of wound that did not show itself on the body. She did not meet Charles Ellsworth until the following morning. She was in the kitchen at 5:30, learning the peculiarities of Harriet's cast iron stoves, when she heard boots on the back stairs, measured, unhurried footsteps that had a deliberate quality, as though the person making them was paying attention to each step individually. The door to the kitchen opened and a tall man came in, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of jaw that had been built for set expressions. He wore a plain cotton shirt and canvas trousers and the suspenders of a working man, and he was clearly surprised to see her, though his face arranged itself into something neutral almost immediately. "You're new," he said. "Emma Walker," she said. "Mrs. Dunmore hired me yesterday." He looked at her for a moment with eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that she could not immediately name, the color of sage after rain, she thought, though she could not have said why that occurred to her. "Charles Ellsworth," he said. He did not offer his hand, and she noticed that he kept a careful distance from her, not unfriendly exactly but bounded, as though he had drawn a perimeter around himself some time ago and maintained it out of habit. "Are you wanting coffee?" she asked. "I've just got it started." "I'll wait," he said, and sat down at the far end of the long kitchen table with a copy of the previous week's Caldwell Post that he opened and read with focused attention. And that was the whole of their first conversation. Over the following days, Emma assembled the facts of him the way you assemble a puzzle when someone has taken away the box, one piece at a time, from whatever you happen to find. He was a cattleman, or had been. He worked now as a hand at the Reardon Ranch 3 miles south of town, and came in each evening quiet with the kind of tiredness that is physical but not only physical. He had been a soldier, she could tell from the way he sat, from the way he watched doorways, from the way he flinched very slightly at the sound of the farrier's hammer from the livery down the street. He ate everything put in front of him without complaint or compliment, which she found oddly touching, as though he had been taught in some hard school that gratitude for small things was not a luxury that could be assumed. He paid his board on time every Saturday morning in exact coin. The other boarders, 2 cattle buyers, a land surveyor, a telegraph operator named Amos Finch who talked constantly, a retired sheriff named Garland who did not, formed the general texture of the boarding house's social life. They played cards in the parlor on evenings, argued about the cattle market and the railroad and the ongoing question of what would happen when Indian Territory was eventually opened, and treated Emma with a mixture of courtesy and barely concealed curiosity that she had learned was the standard attitude toward any unaccompanied woman in a cattle town. Charles Ellsworth sat with them sometimes in the evenings, but rarely participated in the general conversation. He listened. He was a thorough listener, the kind of person who actually absorbs what is said rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. And Emma noticed, over those first days, that when he did say something it was usually short and usually accurate and occasionally so quietly funny that you almost missed it. "Garland," he said one evening when the retired sheriff was describing a particularly complicated dispute from his days in office, "you've told that story 3 times and the number of outlaws in it goes up each time." Garland stopped, considered this, and then grinned. "A story improves with aging, Ellsworth, like whiskey. Or it deteriorates like milk." It was the most Emma had heard him say in 5 days, and she laughed before she could stop herself. He glanced at her across the parlor briefly, and then looked away, and she thought there might have been the beginning of something in his expression, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. The work at the boarding house was considerable, and Emma threw herself into it with the energy of someone who has learned that occupation is the best hedge against sorrow. She was up before 5 each morning, and usually did not stop until 9 in the evening. She managed Harriet's accounts, which were in a state of organized chaos that took her a solid week to untangle, and she cooked and cleaned and helped with the laundry on Mondays and the bread baking on Wednesdays. She was good at all of it. She had been raised on a farm in Illinois, and the domestic arts of the frontier were not foreign to her, though the conditions were rougher than she had been accustomed to. She thought on those long evenings when she sat with Harriet in the kitchen after the day's work was done, and they drank weak tea and talked, beginning to find something that was not yet happiness, but was at least its approximation, a feeling of useful days, of labor that had clear results, of small satisfactions accumulated like coins. What she had not yet resolved was the loneliness, which was a different animal from grief and required different management. She missed having someone to talk to the way she had talked to Thomas, not about important things necessarily, just the ordinary commerce of two people who know each other well enough to say whatever comes to mind. She missed having someone know her. On the evening of the 12th day after her arrival, she was in the kitchen garden at dusk, pulling the last of the day's weeds from between the rows of beans, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Charles Ellsworth standing at the garden gate. "Mrs. Dunmore sent me," he said. "She said to tell you supper's going cold." "I know," Emma said, sitting back on her heels. "I'll be in directly. I wanted to get these cleared before the morning." He looked at the garden with the particular assessment of someone who has worked the land. "You've got hornworms on those tomatoes," he said, nodding toward the far end of the row. "See those holes in the leaves? They're hard to spot because they match the green, but they'll strip the plant overnight if you leave them." Emma looked where he indicated. She could see the damage now that he'd pointed to it. "I don't see the worms. You have to look along the main stem up close." He paused at the gate, seeming to calculate something. Then, with the air of someone making a small decision, he pushed it open and came into the garden and crouched down beside the tomato plant and pointed to a hornworm so perfectly camouflaged that Emma nearly pressed her face against the leaves before she saw it. "There," he said. "Good Lord," she said. "How do you know about kitchen gardens?" "My mother kept one," he said, standing, "in Virginia." It was the first personal thing she had heard him say, and she received it carefully, as you receive something fragile from someone who is not certain they wanted to hand it over. "I'm from Illinois," she said. "We had a kitchen garden, too. My mother grew the best sweet corn in the county, though she was the only one who said so." He looked at her then directly, and the beginnings of that near smile came back to his face. "That's the usual credential for the best sweet corn," he said. She laughed, and this time he did smile small, a little rusty with disuse but genuine. "I'll get the worms in the morning," she said, "before anything else." He nodded, started toward the gate, and then stopped. "You were a farmer," he said. It was not quite a question. "My husband was," she said. "I was a farmer's wife, which is most of the same work but less of the credit." There was a pause in which something shifted slightly between them, some small adjustment in the atmosphere. "Was," he said quietly, not intrusively, the single word acknowledging what it acknowledged without pressing further. "He died in January," she said. "Fever." "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell that he meant it in a way that was not the reflexive expression of condolence but an actual recognition of one specific kind of loss, and it occurred to her to wonder what loss he was recognizing it from. They went inside to supper, and something between them had changed, though neither of them could have described exactly what. The summer deepened and thickened, and the cattle drives came up from Texas along the Kisham Trail, and the town of Caldwell transformed itself periodically into the kind of place that reminded you that civilization was a relatively recent idea in this part of the world. The drovers came in after weeks on the trail, sunburned and trail dirty and possessed of the fierce, complicated energy of men who have been away from towns for a long time, and the saloons did tremendous business, and the jail filled and emptied with tidal regularity. Emma observed all of this from the particular vantage point of the boarding house, which occupied a middle territory between the respectable and the rowdy parts of Caldwell's social life. The cattle buyers who were Harriet's permanent boarders did their business at the stockyards and sometimes at the saloon, and brought back the news of deals struck and prices achieved. And Amos Finch at the telegraph office was a clearinghouse for regional events. And through all of it, Emma began to understand the specific rhythms of this place she had come to. She also began, without precisely intending it, to understand Charles Ellsworth. He had fought at Gettysburg and Cold Harbor and in the Wilderness Campaign. She learned this not from him but from Amos Finch, who had learned it from Garland, who had simply known it the way retired lawmen seem to know things about people, having made a career of it. He had come back from the war at 22 with the specific damage that the Army of the Potomac gave its survivors as a parting gift, and had drifted west because west was where men with that quality of damage went, because the west was large enough that you could put some distance between yourself and whatever you were carrying. He had not talked about the war, Garland told her, not once in the 2 years he had boarded here. He had not, as far as anyone knew, formed any attachments in Caldwell. He worked and he ate and he read, and he existed with a sort of careful self-containment that the other boarders had learned to respect and leave undisturbed, the way you learn to leave alone the bank of coals in a banked fire that could, under the wrong circumstances, still burn you. Emma thought about this information for several days before she did anything with it. What she did with it, eventually, was simply continue to be herself in his presence, not performing any particular quality for him, not softening herself or sharpening herself, just being present and direct and occasionally funny, because those were her natural characteristics, and she had learned, after Thomas's death, that performing anything for anyone was an exhausting enterprise that left you more alone than actual solitude. She talked to him in the mornings over coffee, brief practical conversations that concerned the weather or the state of the garden or whatever had appeared in the Caldwell Post. She did not push or pull at him. She simply left space, the way you leave space when you are trying to befriend a cautious animal, not advancing, not retreating, simply being there consistently so that the space between you fills naturally over time. It worked, slowly. By the end of the second week, he was arriving at the kitchen table 20 minutes earlier in the mornings, though he would have denied that this was intentional. By the third week, he was participating in the evening conversations in the parlor more regularly, and twice she caught him watching her with that particular attentiveness he reserved for things he was trying to figure out. It was in the beginning of the third week that something happened which changed the nature of what was between them. She had been in the kitchen after supper, washing up, and she had burned her hand on the stove edge, nothing serious, a reddening across the back of her left hand that stung fiercely and announced its presence with the kind of consistent sharp pain that makes it difficult to think about anything else. She was running cold water over it from the pump when Charles came in from the back door, having returned from a late errand at the livery, and saw her standing at the pump with her eyes closed and her jaw set. "What happened?" he asked immediately. "Burned my hand," she said. "It's not serious." He crossed the kitchen to her and, without asking permission or giving her time to decline, took her hand gently in both of his and looked at it. His hands were large and calloused and marked with the small scars of ranch work, but they held her hand with an extraordinary carefulness, the way you hold something you know can break. "Does Harriet have any lard?" he asked. "In the cool box," she said. She was very aware of his hands holding hers, more aware of it than the burning, which was saying something. He went to the cool box and came back with the lard and applied a small amount to the burn with the same deliberate gentleness, and wrapped her hand in a clean cloth he found in the drawer. His face throughout this process was focused and efficient, and she thought she could see something working behind his eyes that was not clinical, a care that had somewhere to go now that it had been given a practical direction. "My older brother was a field surgeon," he said, not quite explaining, as he tied off the cloth. "He taught me some things." "Did he survive the war?" she asked. The question landed in the space between them. Charles was quiet for a moment, still holding her wrapped hand in his, and she thought she had overstepped. Then he said, "No, Spotsylvania, 64. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it the way he had meant his condolence to her specifically, not reflexively. He looked at her then, and she looked back, and something passed between them that had no practical name. He released her hand slowly, as though he had not quite decided to. "Get some sleep," he said. "It'll hurt less by morning." She stood in the kitchen after he left and held her wrapped hand against her chest, and understood that she was in a great deal of trouble, in the particular way of being in trouble that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the heart making decisions that the mind has not yet approved. The thing about Charles Ellsworth was that once he began to open, he opened like country, gradually, with a great deal of space in it, but the space was the kind that held things rather than emptied them. He had a dry, observational sense of humor that surfaced when he was comfortable, small and precise, landing like well-placed stones. He had opinions about everything from cattle breeding to the poetry of Whitman, which surprised her. He had strong feelings about loyalty and an evident discomfort with dishonesty that went deep enough that you could tell it had been tested. He had, she discovered over multiple mornings, a remarkable capacity for listening that she had undervalued because it presented itself so quietly. He was also, she discovered, profoundly and practically kind, in ways that were not announced. He repaired a broken fence gate in Harriet's yard without being asked, and without mentioning it. He helped Amos Finch with a crate that was too heavy for one man 3 separate times without keeping count. When one of the cattle buyer boarders received news that his daughter was ill, Charles was the one who poured him a glass of whiskey and sat with him in the parlor until 11 in the evening and said, Emma imagined, exactly the right amount of nothing. She loved him for it. She recognized the feeling with the direct clarity of a woman who had loved once before and knew what it felt like. The way your attention reorganized itself. The way his presence in a room changed the character of the room. The way you found yourself keeping small things to tell him later. It frightened her considerably, because she was 7 months from a grave in Wichita, and she was 43 cents poor, and she was still learning how to be in this town, and falling in love with a quiet, damaged man who kept a perimeter around himself seemed like an undertaking that required more steadiness than she was sure she possessed. But the heart does not consult the mind about its schedule, and by the 3rd week she was quite simply in love with him, and managing the fact of it as practically as she managed everything else. It was on a Tuesday evening in the middle of the 3rd week that they had their first real conversation, not the brief kitchen exchanges or the parlor pleasantries, but an actual conversation, long and ranging and real. She had been sitting on the back steps of the boarding house after supper, watching the sky go to colors over the flat Kansas plain, the particular spectacular sunsets of that country that happened, because the sky was so much larger than anything else and had room to do what it liked with the light. She had a glass of cool water and she was simply sitting, which was a thing she rarely allowed herself. Charles came out and stopped when he saw her, and she could see the calculation pass across his face, whether to retreat, whether to keep to his established perimeter. She did not say anything, did not invite or dismiss, simply continued watching the sky. After a moment he sat on the steps beside her, not close, the careful distance he maintained, and looked at the sunset. For several minutes they sat in that companionable silence that is only possible between people who have already established something between them, even if that something has not been named. "Do you miss Virginia?" she asked eventually, not looking at him, keeping her eyes on the burning colors in the west. She heard him consider the question. "Sometimes," he said. "It's different country, greener, the light is different." A pause. "A lot of it is gone anyway, the war changed things there." "My father was in the Mexican War," she said. "He came back different. I didn't understand it then, I was young, but I understand it now." Different how? She thought about it. Quieter in the wrong places, like he'd put away certain parts of himself somewhere and forgotten where. He was still a good father. He was still himself in most ways, but there were rooms in him that didn't open anymore. Charles was quiet for a long time. The sun was at the very edge of the flat horizon now, bleeding orange and violet into the vast sky. "That's an accurate description," he said at last. "The war," she said gently. "Not a question, not a demand, just an acknowledgement." "The wilderness," he said. And then slowly, in the way of something that has been sealed for a long time being carefully unsealed, he began to talk. Not about the battles specifically, not about the blood and the mechanics of what happened in that terrible Virginia forest in May of 1864, but about the weight of it, the specific gravity of having been 19 years old and having seen things that no 19-year-old was constructed to process, and having carried those things alone for nearly a decade, because who do you give them to, and what good would it do? Emma listened the way he had listened to her, fully, without interrupting, without performing sympathy. She just let him talk into the Kansas evening while the colors faded above them and the stars came out one by one. "I stopped praying somewhere in there," he said at some point, with a kind of quiet directness that told her he had not said this to anyone before. "I started out praying, morning and night, my mother's habit, but somewhere in the second year I couldn't figure out who I was talking to anymore, couldn't make it feel real, so I stopped." Emma held her glass of water in both hands and looked at the first clear stars appearing in the east. "I stopped too," she said, "after Thomas died. I said the 23rd Psalm at the graveside because I knew it and it seemed required, and after that I couldn't find the way back into it. It felt like a door I'd lost the key to." "That's exactly what it is," he said. "You lose the key somewhere and you don't know when you dropped it." "My mother would be horrified," Emma said. "She prays before every meal and every night and for every occasion. She prays about the weather." "My mother too," he said. There was something almost warmly sorrowful in his voice when he mentioned his mother. "She's still alive?" Emma asked. "In Richmond. She writes letters I don't deserve and I write letters back that say less than they should." Emma understood a great deal in that sentence. "You could go back," she said, without weight, simply putting it on the table. "No," he said, and there was something final in it that she did not press against. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Being back there would put me back inside it somehow, I think. The distance helps." She nodded. She understood distance as a management tool. She had exercised it herself coming here. They talked until the stars were thoroughly out and a warm Kansas night wind moved through the yard, stirring the leaves of Harriet's kitchen garden. They talked about Illinois and Virginia, and what both of them had wanted before what happened to each of them happened. Emma had wanted to be a schoolteacher, had wanted it since she was 12 years old, had filled notebooks with lesson plans that never went anywhere because she married Thomas at 18 and the farm needed her. Charles had wanted to go to university, had been accepted to William and Mary, had never gone because the war started the summer before he was to enroll. "Maybe still," Emma said. "Maybe still," he agreed, in the voice of someone who has not fully abandoned the idea despite a great deal of evidence that it is impractical. When they finally went inside, it was late and the house was quiet. At the bottom of the stairs they stopped, and she looked up at him in the dim light of the hall lamp and he looked down at her, and the space between them had changed. It was still the distance he maintained, but it was no longer the distance of a perimeter. It was the distance of two people who have been honest with each other and are standing in the new landscape of that honesty. "Good night, Emma," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Good night, Charles," she said. She went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and felt something shifting deep in her chest that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but was in the territory between them where real things live. The next morning she got up and went to the kitchen and he was already there, earlier than usual, and she poured coffee and set a cup in front of him without being asked, and he said thank you, and looked up from the paper to look at her for a moment, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Over the following days, the space between them continued to shift. He began to walk with her in the evening sometimes, not with any stated purpose, not with anything arranged, simply falling into step beside her when she went out to the garden, or when she went to the general store for Harriet's supplies. He began to tell her things, unprompted observations about the weather or the cattle or something he had read, small offerings of his inner life, deposited in the way of someone who is testing whether the bridge will hold. She received each one carefully and gave him things back, her own observations, her own thoughts, fragments of her history that she shared selectively, not all at once, understanding that this particular connection was being built slowly, and that slow things built well were worth more than fast things built carelessly. She also, being a woman of practical intelligence, was fully aware that they were moving towards something, and that the something would need to be navigated carefully given that they were both people with significant and recent damage, and that the boarding house of a respectable woman in a cattle town was a constrained social environment with limited privacy and considerable gossip potential. The gossip had, of course, already started. Amos Finch was constitutionally incapable of not noting and commenting on any social development in his vicinity, and within the second week, he had made 3 separate jokes about morning coffee having restorative properties that he had not previously appreciated, all of which Charles deflected with such flat, precise neutrality that Amos eventually abandoned the topic. But Harriet Dunmore watched, and what Harriet saw she kept to herself, and one evening she said to Emma in the kitchen with her usual directness, "He's a good man, that one. Had a hard time of it, but he's good underneath all that quiet. Just so you know my thinking." "I've noticed," Emma said, and that was the whole of the conversation, but it told Emma something she had suspected, that Harriet approved, and Harriet's approval in this household was not a small thing. On a Saturday afternoon in the 4th week, a real Kansas afternoon of that particular late August quality, where the air has both heat and the first whiff of something cooler coming from the north, Charles appeared at the boarding house in the middle of the day, which was unusual because he typically worked through Saturdays at the Reardon Ranch until evening. He came to the kitchen where Emma was making bread and said, without preamble, "Reardon gave the hands the afternoon. I thought if you don't need to be here, there's a decent fishing spot on Bluff Creek, 2 miles out. The water's clear and it's shaded." He stopped. Something in his face was doing something complicated, and she recognized it after a moment as vulnerability, the specific vulnerability of someone who has made an offer and does not know if it will be accepted and very much wants it to be. "I thought you might want to see something other than town for an afternoon," he finished. Emma looked at her bread dough, which was at the stage where it needed an hour to rise regardless of anything she did next. She looked at him. She thought about the fact that she had not been further from the boarding house than the general store in 4 weeks. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. He had borrowed a wagon from the ranch, a simple one with a bench seat, and they drove out of Caldwell in the dry afternoon with the sky enormous above them. And for a while they just drove without much conversation, and the quiet between them was the good kind, the kind that does not require filling. Bluff Creek was exactly what he had promised. A clear, shallow creek moving through a cut bank with cottonwood trees along the edges providing real shade, and the sound of water over stones that was so different from the sounds of the town that Emma realized she had not heard it in weeks, and had missed it without knowing she had been missing it. They fished for a while, which meant sitting on the bank with lines in the water, and talking intermittently about nothing important, the way you can when you are in a comfortable silence with someone. The fishing was not particularly productive, and neither of them particularly cared. Emma took off her shoes and put her feet in the water because the afternoon was hot, and the creek was cold, and she did not care what was proper, and Charles watched her do it with an expression that she thought contained something that wanted to be warmth. "Tell me something you've never told anyone else," she said, the boldness of the afternoon and the creek and the shade making her brave. He was quiet for a while. A small fish moved under the water near her feet. "I'm afraid of the dark," he said at last, with the careful precision of someone stating an accurate and slightly shameful fact. "Since the wilderness, the worst of it happened at night. I sleep with a candle now. I've slept with a candle every night for 9 years, and I've never told anyone because it's not the kind of thing that sounds." He stopped. Dignified, she offered, I was going to say sane, he said. It sounds exactly sane to me, she said. It sounds like your body learned something true and is still carrying it. That's not the same as not being sane. He looked at her across the few feet of bank between them with that particular gray-green regard that she had come to understand as his version of intensity. He was not an expressive face person, but his eyes, when he let you look into them, told you considerably more than his face offered. Your turn, he said. Something you've never told anyone, she thought about it. I was relieved, she said carefully. When Thomas died, not that he died, I loved him and I grieved him genuinely. But before he was gone, he was very ill for 2 months, and I was frightened every day and exhausted every night, and I was doing it alone because we had no family close by. And when it ended, I felt relief, and I hated myself for feeling it, and I still do a little. But there it is. She had not said this to anyone. Not to Harriet, not to Thomas's cousin, not to her mother in letters. It had sat in her for 7 months with the weight of something she was ashamed of. He did not flinch from it. That's not shameful, he said. That's what happens when someone you love suffers and you suffer with them and it ends. The relief is for the suffering being finished, not for losing him. She felt something release in her chest, a small caught thing that had been held for months. Her eyes went warm. You're a remarkably decent man, she said, not sentimentally, just stating it. That's a generous assessment, he said. I'm not a generous person as a general rule, she said. I'm practical. I call things what they are. He looked at her for a long moment. Then I'll take it, he said. On the drive back to Caldwell in the long golden light of late afternoon, with the prairie spreading around them in every direction and the first hint of autumn cooling the edge of the wind, he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the seat between them. He did it simply, without production, the way you do something that feels natural. She turned her hand over and held his back. They drove like that all the way to town. The following weeks were characterized by a happiness that surprised Emma in its ordinariness. She had expected love, the second time around, which is what this was becoming, regardless of whether either of them had said so, to be more complicated than this. She had expected it to be fraught with the ghosts of Thomas and the damages of the war, and the general difficulty of two damaged people attempting closeness. And it was, sometimes. There were mornings when Charles arrived in the kitchen with the shuttered look that meant he had slept badly or dreamed badly, and she learned to give him space on those mornings and come back to him in the afternoon. There were evenings when she was sharp and unhappy for reasons that were not precisely about the present, and he learned to sit with her sharpness without trying to smooth it away, which was the right instinct. But alongside all of that, and more frequently than either of them had expected, there was simply the pleasure of it, the pleasure of having someone to talk to and laugh with and think alongside, the particular domestic contentment of two people who are good company for each other, which is its own kind of love and perhaps the most durable kind. In early September, a letter arrived for Charles from his mother in Richmond. He read it at the kitchen table, and she watched something cross his face that was ancient and complicated and tender and painful all at once, the face of someone looking at a thing they love from a great distance. "She's well?" Emma asked. "Better than well. My sister had a baby. My mother is a grandmother." He set the letter down and looked at it. "She wants me to come home." Emma's heart did something involuntary. She stilled it. "Do you want to go?" she asked carefully. He was quiet for a long time. "Not yet," he said. "I want to be more finished first, more ready to go back to a place that has all of that in it." He looked at her then. "I want to have something to go back with." She held his gaze. "That last part," she said, "deserves some clarification." He looked at his hands, which were folded on the table, and then back up at her. The morning light came in the east window and caught the gray-green of his eyes, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had never seen that particular color in anyone else's face. "I think you know what I mean," he said, "and I think you have something to say about whether it's a conversation worth having." "I do," she said, "and it is." He let out a breath that had something of relief in it. "Good," he said. "That's good." It was not a declaration exactly. It was both of them acknowledging that they were going in a direction, without having to perform the full drama of saying so. It was, Emma thought, exactly right for them. On the Sunday morning of that same week, a September morning with the first real coolness in it, the leaves on the cottonwoods beginning to consider their autumn business, Emma was up before 5 and went to the kitchen and found herself standing at the window above the sink, looking out at the gray pre-dawn sky, and something moved in her that was difficult to name. It was not grief, though grief was a component. It was not longing, though longing was there. It was something more fundamental, a sense of being very small under a very large sky and needing to say something to whatever was larger than the sky. She had felt this specific need before, years ago, and had known what to do with it then, had simply spoken into it, simply addressed the large and inarticulate thing that she believed was at the other end of prayer, and had felt better. She had not felt it in 7 months. She had not felt it since she said the 23rd Psalm at Thomas's grave, and felt the words fall into a void. Now she felt it again, and the door did not feel locked. She was not certain what had changed, or whether anything had changed on the other side of the door, or whether the change was simply in her, in the fact that she had survived the worst of what had happened to her, and was, tentatively, building something from what remained. She closed her eyes and stood at the kitchen window and prayed. She did not use formal words. She said approximately that she was grateful for the kitchen garden and the boarding house and the decent woman who ran it, and the decent man who was sleeping upstairs in the room at the end of the hall, and she said she was sorry she had been quiet for so long, and she was not sure she had all the theology right, but she was going to keep talking and hope for the best. It felt, in the way that prayer sometimes feels when it works, like exhaling something you had been holding for too long. She was at the stove starting the coffee when she heard the back stairs and Charles came in, earlier than usual, in the way he had developed of arriving early, and stopped when he saw her face. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I was praying actually, first time in a while." He stood very still. "Me too," he said. "Upstairs, I woke up before light and he stopped. First time since the war." She looked at him across the kitchen in the gray morning. "Around the same time?" she asked. He considered. "I don't know exactly, maybe." She did not say anything to that. She poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table, and they sat together in the early morning quiet. And there was something in the air between them that had the quality of something important having happened, something that could not be fully explained but did not need to be. "I think," Charles said slowly, looking at his coffee cup, "that some things bring you back to yourself. Some people," he looked up at her, "and when they do, maybe you find your way back to other things too." Emma thought that was probably exactly right. She thought that was one of the most important things anyone had said to her in a long time, and she thought it with a fullness in her chest that was not quite enough to make her cry but was in the general neighborhood. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For being the kind of person who brings someone back to themselves," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The morning began to come in through the kitchen window, pink and tentative. "You did the same for me," he said. September moved through in its golden way, and the weather grew kinder, and the first cool nights arrived with stars so brilliant in that flat Kansas sky that they seemed to have been scrubbed clean. Emma began teaching herself to identify constellations from a book on astronomy she found in the back room of the general store, and Charles, who knew the stars from navigating by them on cattle drives, taught her the ones the book did not explain, not by their formal Greek names, but by the stories that went with them, old stories his mother had told him and his brother on summer nights in Virginia, which felt to Emma like receiving something precious from someone she would never meet. The question of their future began to surface more directly in October, as the cattle season wound toward its end, and the town of Caldwell took on a quieter character without the constant influx of Texas drovers. Charles had a conversation with the Reardon family about what the winter work would look like: reduced crew, reduced pay. And he came back from that conversation with a thoughtful expression that indicated he had been doing mathematics. He asked Emma one evening to walk with him, and they went down toward the south end of town where the stockyards were empty now, and the pen stood clean and wooden against the blue October sky, and he said, "I have been thinking." "I know," she said. "You've had the thinking face for 3 days. Is it obvious? To me it is." He made a small acknowledging sound. "Reardon offered me a permanent position, not seasonal, a foreman position to start in the spring. It comes with a wage that could support—" He stopped. "2 people," she offered. He looked at her sideways. "I was going to say a household," he said, "but yes." Emma stopped walking. She turned to face him in the October light that was making everything gold and amber, and she looked at him directly and said, "Charles Ellsworth, if you are building toward asking me to marry you, I would be grateful if you would arrive there more directly, because I have been waiting a considerable time and I have a limited store of patience." He looked at her and then he actually laughed, not the small rusty near smile she had collected over months, but a real laugh, warm and surprised and better than she had imagined it would be, which was saying something because she had spent some time imagining it. "Emma Walker," he said, recovering, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He looked at her as though he was still slightly disbelieving his good fortune, which she found endearing in a way she had not expected endearing to be. He stepped close to her finally, at last, closing that carefully maintained distance, and his hands came up to her face, and he kissed her with a deliberateness and a gentleness that managed to say, simultaneously, that he had wanted to do this for a long time, and that he understood it to be the beginning of something permanent, and that he did not take either fact lightly. She kissed him back and put her hands against his chest where she could feel his heart beating steady and solid, and the October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek at the edge of town, and the sky was very blue, and she realized with a quiet and complete certainty, exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in November, in the front parlor of Harriet Dunmore's boarding house, by a Methodist minister who came through Caldwell once a month, and performed his ecclesiastical duties with a cheerful practicality entirely appropriate to the frontier. The ceremony was small Harriet, who was visibly emotional in a way that she converted immediately into intense activity, getting the refreshments arranged. Garland, who stood as Charles's witness with the grave pride of a man who had watched from the sidelines and felt his faith in good outcomes vindicated. Amos Finch, who told the story of noticing that something was happening between them 3 separate times with increasing embellishment. Emma wore a dress of dark blue wool that Harriet had helped her sew from material ordered from Wichita, and she carried a small arrangement of late autumn flowers from the kitchen garden that she had dried and pressed over the preceding weeks. Charles wore his best coat and a white shirt and had, Emma noticed, successfully gotten his hair cut, which she chose not to mention because she knew it had been intentional, and knew that pointing it out would embarrass him. When the minister asked the relevant questions, Charles answered in a clear, quiet voice with an absolutely unwavering directness that told everyone in the room that he had considered every word he was about to say and meant all of it. When it was Emma's turn, she looked at him, this quiet, careful, complicated, tender man with the color of sage in his eyes, and said yes with her whole heart. Harriet gave them a small adjoining room at the end of the hall for their first month, and in February they moved into a house on the eastern edge of Caldwell that Charles had found and repaired through the winter. It was small and it needed work, and the winter wind found every gap in the planking, but it had a kitchen garden space and a view of the flat Kansas plain that went all the way to where the earth met the sky, and Emma stood in the doorway of it on their first morning there, and felt the particular satisfaction of a space that is going to be made into something. They made it into something through that winter, the practical way, calking the gaps and patching the roof and building up a supply of wood and planning the kitchen garden for spring. They learned each other in the specific way of people who live together in a small space, the morning habits and the preferences and the tender sorenesses, and the things that were funny at the right moment, and the things that were not. Charles turned out to be an excellent and uncomplaining partner in domestic labor, which she had suspected from the efficiency with which he had wrapped her burned hand, and he turned out to be the kind of husband who listened to what she said and remembered it, which was the quality she had always found most romantic in men and the rarest. She turned out for him to be the kind of wife who understood that there were days when he needed quiet and did not take the quiet personally, and the kind of woman who could argue her position clearly and without cruelty, and knew how to end an argument as cleanly as she had started one. She also turned out, to both their considerable delight, to be genuinely funny, the dry observational kind of funny that matched his own, and he laughed more that winter than he had laughed in 9 years, which he told her once quietly in the dark, and which she received as the greatest compliment she had ever been given. He wrote to his mother in Richmond. He told her he had gotten married, and he described Emma in terms that Emma felt when she read the letter over his shoulder with his permission, were careful and precise and quietly reverent in the way that told her exactly what she needed to know about how he saw her. His mother wrote back with a warmth that leaped off the page, the warmth of a woman who had worried for a very long time about her son in Kansas, and was choosing this moment, gratefully, to put most of that worry down. In March, Charles took the foreman position at Reardon's ranch officially, and the increased wage made a difference that was practical and allowed for some planning. Emma had a conversation with the local school board. Caldwell was in the process of organizing a proper school, a 2-room wooden building going up at the north edge of town, and presented herself as a candidate for the position of teacher. The board was composed of 4 men who were, in Emma's assessment, divided between those who thought a woman teaching school was entirely proper, and those who thought it was somewhat irregular. But the fact that Caldwell had a serious shortage of qualified teachers tipped the practical argument in her favor, and by April she was teaching 32 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 in the new schoolhouse, which smelled of fresh pine and chalk, and the particular hope of education in a new place. She loved it. She loved it in the immediate and visceral way of someone who has found the work they were always supposed to be doing. She was good at it, good at holding a room of 32 children of wildly different ages and abilities, good at making the dry mechanics of reading and arithmetic alive for small people who were not sure why they needed either. She came home in the evenings talking about her students. This one who had cracked the code of reading in the space of an afternoon, that one who was struggling with numbers but had an extraordinary grasp of geography, the shy girl from the Mennonite family who had said something so unexpectedly precise about a poem that Emma had to turn to the blackboard to compose her face. Charles listened to all of it with his characteristic full attention, and asked questions that were good questions, the kind that told you the person asking had actually been following the conversation, and occasionally made observations about the children she described that were so accurate she suspected he had better intuitions about people than he let on. Spring turned into summer, and summer was as it had been the previous year, the cattle drives and the heat and the enormous flat sky, but Emma was inside it now rather than arriving to it, and the town was intelligible to her in a way it had not been the year before. She knew people. She knew the rhythms and the arguments and the gossip and the economics, and she was known in return, which was the thing she had been missing when she stood in the middle of Front Street with her trunk and her 43 cents. In July, she realized she was carrying a child. She told Charles on a Sunday evening, standing in their kitchen after supper, with the summer light still coming through the window at an angle that made the whole room golden. She had not planned how to tell him, had thought about planning it, and then decided that planning these things was against her nature, and she would simply tell him when the moment was right, and this moment was right. He went very still. She watched the information travel through him, watched something happen in his face that was so unguarded and complete that she felt she had seen something rare and private. Then he crossed the kitchen to her and held her with both arms, and his face was pressed against her hair, and he did not say anything for a long time, which was, she thought, the right response. "I'm frightened," she said honestly into his shoulder. "So am I," he said, "a reasonable amount." "And glad?" she asked. "So much," he said. "More than I have words for." She felt him breathe, a long, slow exhale of something. "We'll be all right," he said, and she recognized in his voice that he was saying this as much to himself as to her, which was honest, and she loved him for it. The pregnancy was ordinary in most respects and difficult in some. The summer heat made her miserable in August, and she taught her school through it with a stubbornness that the other women in town noted with varying attitudes of admiration and concern. Charles brought her cold water with ice from the ice house without being asked, and made sure there was always something cool and easy to eat when she came home, and did not complain about the fact that she fell asleep before 8 o'clock most evenings of that trimester. Harriet Dunmore appointed herself an advisor-at-large on the pregnancy, and arrived at the house at least twice a week, with contributions from her kitchen and practical information, some of which was useful, and some of which Emma privately classified as folk wisdom of the optimistic variety. Garland, with the apparent determination of a man who intends to be a grandfather regardless of the biological inconvenience, took to stopping by on Saturday mornings with small pieces of wood he was shaping into something. She could not always tell what, with the focused patience of a man who had time and a skill, and a reason to use it. By September, when Emma continued teaching despite being visibly pregnant, there was one school board member who raised the question of propriety, to which Emma responded in a meeting that she had the educational qualifications, an enthusiastic class, and a perfectly functional brain regardless of her current condition, and would they like to discuss which of them was prepared to stand in front of 32 children for the next several months, because she would wait. The board member did not pursue the subject. Charles was, through all of this, quietly magnificent. He did not fuss, which she had told him she would not tolerate, but he was present in every practical and meaningful way, and there were nights when she woke at odd hours and found him already awake. The old habit of bad nights, which had not entirely departed though they came less frequently now, and they would talk in the dark until whatever had woken him settled, and those conversations were some of the best they had. Unfiltered by daylight, without the social organization of daytime, they talked about everything: their fears for the child, their memories of their own childhoods, the things they wanted to teach this person they were bringing into the world, the things they hoped for, the world they wanted Kansas to become. It was on one of those nights, lying awake in the October dark, that Charles said, "I wrote to my mother about the baby." "What did she say?" Emma asked. "She wants to come," he said, "in the spring when things are settled." "She wants to meet you." Emma was quiet for a moment. "And do you want her to come?" "Yes," he said, and there was a simplicity in it that told her he had been thinking about this for some time and had arrived at a clear answer. "I think I'm ready for that, to let some of the distance go." She found his hand in the dark and held it. "Good," she said. "She'll love you," he said. "She'll tell you she loved you within 10 minutes of meeting you, and she'll mean it, and it'll be a little overwhelming." "I can manage overwhelming," Emma said. "I manage 32 children 5 days a week." She felt him shake in the silent laugh. She knew as well now as his speaking voice. The baby came in February, in the middle of a Kansas winter night, with Harriet in attendance and a doctor named Ferris who had set up practice in Caldwell 6 months earlier, and who was, Emma was grateful to discover, in the particular crucible of those hours, both competent and calm. Charles was in the front room during most of it, which was the convention of the time, and which he obeyed only because Emma told him to. And she knew from the quality of silence that came from that direction that he was sitting very still and holding himself in with considerable effort. When Harriet brought him in to see her, he crossed the room to where she lay with the baby on her chest and crouched down and looked at his son, a boy, solid and loud and already apparently possessed of strong opinions about the temperature of the room, and his face did the fully unguarded thing that she had seen once before in the kitchen, and she stored this version of it alongside that one, as things to keep. "He's all right?" Charles asked, which was the first thing he said, looking at the baby. "He's perfect," Harriet said firmly. 9 pounds and perfectly formed and mad as a wet hen, which is a good sign." "He's all right," Emma confirmed, adjusting the baby against her chest. "We're both all right." Charles put one hand very carefully on the baby's head, the large calloused ranchwork hand, so careful, and looked at Emma with an expression that said more than any vocabulary he possessed, and she looked back at him with the same. They named him Thomas James Ellsworth. Thomas for Emma's first husband, acknowledged and honored and given a place in this new life without being the ghost in it. James for Charles's brother, the field surgeon who died at Spotsylvania, and who Charles carried in a private grief that was slowly, in the way of all slow things that actually heal, becoming something he could hold at arm's length instead of at his chest. Young Thomas James was a very particular kind of child almost immediately. He was loud and direct and interested in everything, and Emma recognized her own inclinations in him with a mixture of pride and trepidation. He slept in the way that babies sometimes sleep when they have made up their minds to do it thoroughly, and he ate with considerable enthusiasm, and he looked at the world with eyes that were going to be gray-green. It became clear in the first weeks, the exact shade of his father's. Charles was, from the first days, a remarkable father. Emma had not been entirely sure how it would go. She had been fairly certain he would love the child, but love and competence are separate skills, and the particular competence of fathering a very small person is its own territory. He was good at it in the same way he was good at ranch work, attentive, unhurried, practical in the right moments and patient in the others. He walked Thomas James in the evenings when the baby was restless, these long, slow circuits of the small house, talking to him in a low voice about whatever came to mind, which Emma would sometimes hear from the next room, and which was occasionally about the cattle, and occasionally about the constellations, and occasionally about things she could not quite make out, but which had the rhythm of stories being told. Spring came, and with it Eugenia Ellsworth, who arrived from Richmond on the stage in April with 2 large trunks and an immediate, comprehensive love of everything she encountered. She was small and fine-boned, and she had Charles's eyes exactly, and she walked into Emma's house and took Emma's hands and said, "You are exactly who I hoped for, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." And Emma, who had been prepared for a long, careful process of establishing a relationship with her mother-in-law, found herself laughing instead. Eugenia was in Caldwell for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks she made herself useful in the particular way of women who cannot be comfortable unless they are contributing. And she and Emma developed a genuine affection that was built on the discovery that they were more similar in temperament than either had expected. They were both direct, both practical, both possessed of a dry humor that manifested when you least expected it. Eugenia also watched her son with a mother's eye that contained a decade's accumulated worry, and Emma watched her watch him and saw the relief moving through her as the days passed. On the last evening before Eugenia's departure, Emma came to the kitchen to find Charles and his mother sitting at the table talking quietly, and she stopped in the doorway and watched them. The mother and the son who had been separated by a great distance, not only the miles but all the weight that the war had put between them, and they were talking in the easy way of people who are finally finding their way back to each other, and Charles was laughing at something his mother had said. And Eugenia was looking at him with an expression that was somewhere between joy and the specific deep relief of a woman who has been afraid for a very long time and can now, at last, set it down. Emma went back to the parlor and gave them their time, and thought about the ways in which love, in all its forms, was stubborn enough to survive almost anything if you did not entirely give up on it. Eugenia went back to Richmond with a promise to return in the winter, which she kept, arriving in December with Christmas gifts and staying until February, which encompassed enough of Thomas James's first year that she could tell her Richmond friends about every developmental milestone with the authority of an eyewitness. The school year that autumn was Emma's second at the Caldwell school, and she had the particular satisfaction of seeing some of her students from the previous year advancing. The girl who had cracked reading in an afternoon was now reading far above her grade level. The boy who struggled with numbers had found his footing and was progressing steadily. She had a new cohort of small people to introduce to the extraordinary fact that language was written down and could be read, which remained, no matter how many times she watched it happen, one of the most compelling things she had ever seen. The school had a second teacher now, a young woman named Clara who had come from Topeka, and Emma and Clara got on extremely well and divided the student population by age and traded methods, and argued productively about pedagogy on Thursday afternoons while their students did their independent work. Clara was 23 and had a cheerful directness that reminded Emma of herself a few years earlier, before the particular editing that grief performs on a person, and Emma found in the friendship a pleasure she had not expected to find so easily in this town. Caldwell itself was changing through those years. The cattle trade brought money, and money brought more permanent structures, and more permanent structures brought more families, and more families brought churches and schools and civic organizations. And the rough trade town character of the place Emma had arrived in was gradually acquiring the layering of an actual community. There were still Saturday nights in the saloon that reminded you of the wildness underneath, and there were still Indian Territory questions and land disputes, and the particular lawlessness that proximity to the territory created, and Caldwell's marshals had eventful careers. But the days were also full of school board meetings and church socials and women's sewing circles, and the general texture of people deciding to stay. Charles rose steadily at the Reardon Ranch through that second and third year, and Reardon, who was a man of 60 and beginning to think about the eventual disposition of his property and affairs, trusted him increasingly with decisions that went beyond day-to-day management. Charles had a genuine understanding of cattle, not only the mechanics but the economics, and he had the quality of being trusted by the men who worked under him, which is the rarest and most important quality in a foreman. He also, during this period, continued to find his way back to himself in the small daily ways that accumulation makes significant. He slept better, though not always easily. The candle was still there at night, and she had never made anything of it. The worst of the bad nights became less frequent. He went to church on Sundays at the Methodist, not out of compulsion, but out of something that had returned to him gradually. The sense of it being a conversation worth having, that he had described to Emma in their kitchen in their third week of knowing each other. He was not a man who spoke easily about what was inside him, and Emma had long since accepted this as a feature rather than a flaw, because what was inside him came out in other ways, in the thoroughness of his attention, in the small practical kindnesses that were so constant as to be invisible, in the way he held Thomas James in the evenings, in the way he looked at Emma when he did not know she was watching him. On a spring evening of their third year of marriage, Emma came home from the schoolhouse to find Charles in the kitchen garden. Thomas James was 15 months old and sitting in the dirt at Charles's feet with complete contentment, examining a stick with the total concentration of a scientist, and Charles was turning over the soil in the tomato bed with a careful thoroughness, and he looked up when Emma came through the gate and smiled at her. Not the small, rusty near-smile of those early mornings in Harriet Dunmore's kitchen, but the full, open smile she had worked so long to see, and which now appeared regularly, generously, as though it had always been there waiting. She stood at the gate and looked at him and their mud-covered son in the golden late afternoon, and she thought about the woman who had stood in the middle of Front Street 2 years ago with her trunk and her 43 cents and her dead husband's name in her coat, And she thought about the man who had sat at Harriet's kitchen table with his newspaper and his careful perimeter and his 9 years of sealed rooms. She thought about Bluff Creek and the burned hand and the back steps at sunset and the word, yes, and the November parlor ceremony and a February baby who had his father's eyes. She thought about not praying and then praying again, separately and at roughly the same time in the gray morning of the third week, which she had come to think of as the moment when both of them, without coordinating it, turned a corner. "What are you smiling at?" Charles asked. "Everything," she said, which was accurate. He looked at her a moment longer and then held out his hand to her, and she came through the gate and took it. And Thomas James looked up from his stick examination to observe his parents holding hands with the scientific interest he brought to everything, and then went back to the stick, and the evening sun came down on all of them, warm and without reservation. That summer Charles made an offer for 40 acres of land south of Caldwell, from a family that was moving back east after 3 years had convinced them the frontier was not for them. It was good land, reasonably watered, with an existing structure that needed work and soil that Charles assessed as viable for both grazing and crops. Emma walked every foot of it on a Sunday afternoon before they decided, Thomas James on her hip, and at the far southern edge where a line of cottonwoods marked a seasonal creek, she stopped and looked at the land and felt it underneath her feet in the way you feel a thing when it is going to matter to you. "Yes," she said. They worked the land through that autumn and the following spring, Charles and 2 hired men building up the main structure and fencing the grazing acreage and putting in a proper kitchen garden plot that was 4 times the size of Harriet's. And Emma planned what she would plant with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. She still taught school, she was not going to give that up, and Charles had never suggested she should. But the rhythms of the farm were hers in the mornings and the evenings, the old rhythms she had known since childhood, and they fit her better in this place and this life than they had in Wichita because they were hers rather than borrowed. Thomas James grew into a solid, cheerful, serious when the occasion demanded boy who wanted to know the name of everything, and had his father's way of listening and his mother's way of arguing, which meant that by the age of 3, he was already winning more debates than a child his age had any business winning. Charles taught him the stars as he had learned them, sitting out on the porch of the farm on summer nights, telling the stories that went with each one, and Emma sat in the doorway and listened to Charles's voice, low and patient and warm, and thought that this was a thing she would keep inside herself forever. In the summer of 1877, when Thomas James was 4, Emma discovered she was pregnant again, and this time there was less fear in it and more straightforward gladness, from both of them, in proportion to the confidence that comes from having done something difficult once and come through it. This child arrived in April of 1878, a girl this time, with Emma's dark hair and a set of lungs that suggested she had opinions about her arrival. They named her Eliza Jane for Emma's mother, who upon hearing this piece of news wrote a letter so thoroughly soaked with emotion that Emma had to read it in sections. Where Thomas James was his father in personality, contained, observant, deliberate, Eliza Jane appeared to be something entirely her own. She had a quality of aliveness, of engagement with the world, that filled whatever space she was in and made you aware that something interesting was probably about to happen. She was determined to be wherever Thomas James was and to do whatever he was doing, and Thomas James, after a period of negotiating his feelings about this, arrived at the conclusion that a small sister was actually a fine thing to have, particularly if she was the kind who would follow you around with clear admiration, which Eliza Jane was. Charles watched his daughter with an expression that had something helpless in it, the particular helplessness of a man who was not aware of exactly how much he had wanted a girl until one arrived. Emma chose not to point this out to him directly because she enjoyed watching him figure it out. By 1879, they had been married 6 years, and Charles had been offered a full partnership in Reardon's operation. Reardon was 67 and done with the hard physical work of running a ranch and wanted a partner he trusted to carry the real weight. It was a significant offer, the kind that changed the shape of what was possible, and Charles brought it home to Emma and put it on the kitchen table between them like the important thing it was and said, "What do you think?" Emma thought about it seriously, the way she thought about serious things, turning it in her mind and looking at it from different angles. "Will you be happy with the responsibility of it?" she asked. "Not can you do it, I know you can, but is it what you want?" He considered this. "Yes," he said. "I want to build something real here, something that stays." She nodded. "Then accept it," she said. "We'll figure out the rest." He accepted it, and the work expanded, and the farm continued, and Emma taught school through it all, and the children grew and changed and demanded new kinds of attention. And the life of it, the whole complex, specific, ordinary, extraordinary life of it, was more than Emma had thought to ask for when she stood in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street with 43 cents, and a grief she had not yet finished. Harriet Dunmore retired her boarding house in 1880 and sold the building and moved to live with her daughter's family in Lawrence, and she came to say goodbye on a Sunday afternoon and sat in Emma's kitchen and drank tea and looked around at the house with an expression that was composed and full at the same time. "I am very pleased with myself," Harriet told Emma. "For what?" Emma asked. "For hiring you," Harriet said. "Both of you, in a sense, since it was my house where everything happened." She folded her hands in her lap with the satisfaction of someone who has completed a project she is proud of. Emma reached across and took Harriet's hand. "We are very pleased with you too," she said. Harriet went back to Lawrence and they wrote letters, which Emma kept in a box under the bed alongside Thomas's letters and Charles's mother's letters, and a small collection of other things that mattered. On the Sunday morning of their 7th wedding anniversary, November of 1880, Emma came down to the kitchen before light and found Charles already there, which was no longer unusual but still, always pleased her. He had started the coffee, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp lit, and he was writing a letter to his mother, which he did every Sunday, without fail, one of the small faithfulnesses that made up a life. He looked up when she came in, and there was something in his face she recognized as the particular expression of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and knows it. "Anniversary," he said. 7 years, she said. "That's not very long," he said. "And also very long," she said. He stood up from the table and she went to him, and he put his arms around her. And outside the kitchen window the Kansas morning was arriving in its particular way, gray becoming pink, becoming gold over the flat country that still awed her, still took her breath, still felt like possibility stretched horizontal in every direction. She could hear Thomas James beginning to stir upstairs, the particular morning sounds of a 6-year-old who had strong opinions about starting the day, and she knew Eliza Jane would follow the moment she heard her brother. And the kitchen would fill with the complicated weather of 2 small children wanting their breakfast, and there was coffee ready, and Charles's arms were around her, and she thought that this was the specific shape of the life she wanted, this ordinary and extraordinary collection of mornings. "I'm glad I came to Caldwell," she said, into his shoulder. "I'm glad you dragged your trunk down Front Street," he said, which was exactly the right thing to say. She laughed. Upstairs, Thomas James said something loud and cheerful, and Eliza Jane immediately responded, and the sound of small feet hit the floor. Charles kissed her temple and went to pour the coffee, and Emma turned to meet the sound of her children coming down the stairs, and the morning light came in across the kitchen floor in long gold bars, and in the schoolhouse at the north edge of Caldwell, there were books waiting and children who were going to read them. And the farm outside was green with October's last effort, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture. And it was all real, all specific and real, every bit of it earned and chosen and good. She had not expected, standing in grief in a cattle town with 43 cents, to come to this. She said thank you for it, quietly, the way she said it every morning now, into the early light of a day that was already full of the life she had built from what she had been left with. The door was not locked anymore. It had not been locked, she thought, for a very long time. Outside, the Kansas sky was doing its magnificent, uncomplicated thing, going wide and blue above the flat country, above the boarding house where it had all begun, above the schoolhouse where children were learning to read, above the farm where the cattle moved in the morning light, above two people who had stopped praying and found their way back again somewhere around the third week, and had not stopped since.